Hi, welcome to episode 6 of Cryonaut TV. I'm Jake, and today we're going to talk about automating your sounds using Serum. Things like LFOs and envelopes are a great way to bring interest and movement to your sounds, so let's go and see how we can do that exactly. Alright, so here we have Serum. A lot of you are probably already familiar with it, you've been using it for years, or maybe you just picked it up and want to get to know it a little bit better. This is probably my favorite synth right now, out of all the bunch that I have. It can do so many different things. It's just so powerful with all the different options you have. You can use it as a subtractive synthesizer. You can use it as a wavetable synth. You can use a little bit of FM. Lots of different options. And besides all that, you have all these different automation tools right here in this section here that a lot of synths have small portions of that. They may have one envelope, one LFO, maybe they have multiple envelopes or LFOs. But in Serum, you can draw in custom waveforms, just like you can do custom wavetables. You can draw in your own waveforms, whatever you want to do. You can manipulate these envelopes and LFOs and everything as much as you want, which is an awesome thing to do. So, first of all, let's go over all the different modulation options that you do have in Serum. Number one, easily missed, is the mod wheel. If we hover over it, we can get that little help box. So you can take this, you can drag it onto any option you want. Filter cutoff is easy to tell. That's just one way to do that. The mod wheel is used for your keyboard. If you have an actual MIDI keyboard in front of you, chances are it has a pitch wheel and a mod wheel. And the mod wheel is used to control pretty much any parameter you want. Second area will be the envelope. Here we have 3 separate envelopes. And they're all basically the same, except envelope 1 is also the amp section for the whole oscillator, or the whole synth. So this envelope will control whatever parameters you assign to it, but it will also control basically the volume of the synth. What volume of all the oscillators actually goes to the output. Whereas envelopes 2 and 3 will only control the certain parameters that you pick. Next, we have the LFO section here, all 4 of these. Again, lots of different options. You have different waveforms you can pick from here. A couple different modes, the different rate and other things here. Fairly standard, but with a little bit more complexity that you can get into if you want to. Next is over here the velocity and the note section. These are kind of in the same box here. So velocity is how hard you press the key. If you don't actually have a keyboard, then you can actually set the velocity with the MIDI notes that you click and everything. And this can be really cool just to have different effects, for how hard you press the key. We'll get into that in a minute. And then the note section is a varying effect depending on how low or how high of a note you press. So, can get into interesting things there too. And then the last thing we have are these 4 macros over here. And the macros can basically just control multiple options, just like the envelopes and LFOs, but this time it's controlled to one knob. So instead of an LFO or envelope just modulating something for you, you can choose when to bring it up, when to bring it down, how much you want to bring it in and out, and then you can actually draw in automation in your DAW with this macro knob. Or if you're going to do anything live, you can map this knob to a MIDI controller that I don't have configured right now. And then you can use one knob to control, let's say, 7 different things on there. So you obviously don't have 7 hands to control all these different knobs and features, so you can use a macro to control one knob and do all those different things at the same time. All right, so let's get into the mod wheel now. Just briefly, I'm going to be using the filter cutoff for a lot of these because it's easy to see how it affects the sound. So if we go ahead and enable the filter, as we push a note now, it just goes to off because that's how the mod wheel is set. And one interesting thing is if you move the mod wheel, like I'm doing now, you can kind of watch it down here, you don't actually see anything move. And this is going to be a key thing to note with all of Serum. Just because you don't see it moving right now doesn't mean that nothing's happening. So it actually, the mod wheel doesn't show any effect up here in filters until you press a note. So you'll notice that once I press a note, then you can see the filter come into effect with the mod wheel and what it's actually doing. So that's pretty much all that does. It moves the knob whenever you push that up there, so it's just a nice tactile thing you can do, just something to move with your hands if you wanted to. It gives you more control that way. And yes, you can control a lot of different things with the mod wheel if you just kind of throw it on whatever. So once you do that, it's not really changing much of the sound now because these knobs aren't doing anything, but it will affect all those things at the same time. Now we have the 3 envelopes over here. And again, envelope 1 is going to be your amp section as well as manipulating whatever other parameters you want. And then 2 and 3 are just duplicates that only affect the certain parameters. So what I mean by the amp section, if you're not familiar with that, is this controls, let's call it the volume. It's not quite that simple, but it's close enough. So right now, when we push a note, it's coming on and holding for as long as we hold the note, and then basically turning off. There's a really fast release and a really fast attack, but basically it starts and stops when you hit the key and when you let go. Now, if we were to drag this down, we can get a pluck kind of sound. Or if we bring this up, we can get kind of a pad sound. So that kind of brings in the amp portion of this sound. Let's go ahead and init that. So now if we bring in the filter as well, I like using this for a pluck. So you have the pluck sound, but you also have the filter, being affected as if it's a pluck. So you can watch this cutoff kind of dropping down. As soon as we hit the note, it quickly drops and gives it a kind of an interesting sound that I like. And again, you can use this stuff to manipulate the starting point and how much it actually affects it. So basically, if you're not familiar, again, if you drag this up or down, it affects the amount, and you can reverse it then. So that way, if we push a note, the filter opens up as the envelope goes through. So one interesting way that we can use multiple envelopes is if we have just this one as the pluck, but then we have a second envelope controlling the filter at maybe a faster pluck. So if we kind of open this one up just a little bit, so it sounds very similar to when we just have everything on one, but when you have 2 different envelopes, you can have the note decay quicker, or you can have the actual filter cutoff decay faster than the note does. So it just gives it 2 different kind of decays at the same time, which adds a little bit of complexity. So it gives you a little bit more control, and it's just an interesting thing that I like to do. So that's a really cool way you can use envelopes. And next we have LFOs. Again, 4 of them over here that all look the same at the start, just a simple triangle wave. Now, this is what I think is probably one of the coolest things about Serum. You can actually draw custom waveforms. So if you double click in here, you get a new point, and you can bring it in. You can adjust, the slope of these things. And you can do whatever you want with that. Most of the time you can pick from like a saw wave or a sine wave, square wave. You get a couple different options. Maybe you get a few more, but you can't actually have a custom waveform like in here. And so this lets you do pretty much whatever you want with this LFO. So now we have just crazy stuff. So, I mean, if you wanted to do anything kind of different than the norm, this is one way you can definitely get that. If you just wanted to use typical waveforms, if you're wondering where to get those, you click this folder, and here you have basic ones. So you have, saw, down kind of things. Sine waves, square waves, triangle. The square wave is basically just a gate. It's going to be on then off, or off then on. So if you make that, fast, maybe that'll be interesting. You can get some cool effects that way. Depending on what you put it on too, it'll have a different sound. Then we have these other ones down here that are kind of just a little bit different take on some waveforms. And then the one I like is a bit crazy one. It's, again, just something that's a bit crazy. So if you just, maybe don't do this on like your main synth, but if you have a background synth, you just want a little bit of extra something going on to give it life, give it some movement. My key phrases that I always use. This one could be interesting for that. So now another cool thing here is the grid. By default, here, let's move this back to triangle. By default, it's set to 8. So you have 8 sections here, these lines that are the vertical ones. And this is easy to break it. If you wanted to draw in your own sections, you can kind of have it going pretty much on the lines. It won't snap to it, but you can get a rough guideline with that. And then this will help you. If you wanted to keep things on the beat with your LFO, then you can draw it in per this. Now, if you wanted something like triplets, then you could go down to, a 3 or any multiple of 3. So if we put it up to 6, then you have multiple triplets here. So just another way that it will help you draw custom waveforms and adapt things to the exact kind of sound that you want and rhythm that you want. All right, so now for one of the more tricky parts about Serum and the LFOs. This mode section, you see we have trigger, envelope, and off. So what off means is this LFO is constantly running, right? Right now, well, once you hit play, it'll be running. Or once you press a note, it'll be running. So just like with the mod wheel, you didn't actually see any effect until you hit a note. This LFO will be running even though you may not see that little line moving there. So we'll turn on the metronome just to help us kind of see what's going on and hear some of these effects. So if we... So now we can differentiate the beginning and the end of the LFO. So here I'm going to start playing. We're going to hear the metronome, and I'm going to just play the note at random times, and you'll kind of hear where the note comes in, and you can see the little blue line where it starts in this cycle here. So you can hear that I'll push the note at random times, and depending on where it is in the measure in the bar, it will start, from wherever the line is going. So it's not going to start from the beginning every time I hit a note. It's going to start from wherever the thing is in the cycle. And this is very useful if you want to have the same little sound or the same part of the LFO affect the sound at the beginning of every measure or the end of every measure. If you want it to sound the same all the time, then this is the way you want to do it with the off. Now, with trigger, it's going to start from the beginning of the LFO every time a note is played. No matter where it is in the measure, anything like that. So that sounds like this. So you can see whenever I push the note now, it's starting from the beginning, and you can't hear much of it because the filter cutoff is low. So, two very different modes that are good for different things. Now, the trigger is really good if you want your notes to sound the same. Let's say you have shorter notes, if you want it to have the same kind of motion every time you hit that note, then the trigger is going to be really good for that. If you're playing more long sustained notes, then maybe the off mode is better, turning the mode off. It's kind of up to you. There are uses for both, so don't think that one is better than the other. Lastly, we have envelope, and this is basically extending these 3 envelopes into LFOs. You can have another 4 kind of envelopes. And so what it's going to happen is it's going to play through this waveform, this cycle 1 time, and then stop. And then your note will either continue or not, depending on what you have going on. So if your filter ends at off, you may not have a note anymore, or volume. It just kind of depends, but it's going to end up playing the note as long as you hold it, but this LFO is only going to affect it 1 time. So now, this is how that's going to sound. And so because the filter cutoff ends at basically off, we're not hearing any sound. If we brought that up, then the note would continue playing. It would only play through this cycle 1 time, and then the note would just carry on at the last point that you left it. So if we have to grab this little one here. If we leave it halfway, roughly, then it leaves the filter cutoff at that same point. So again, this can be useful, especially if you're drawing a lot of custom stuff here. It's a little different than the envelopes, but it does more or less the same thing. And then of course you have the rate. You can play through, if we put this back off, you can play through it fairly slow, super fast, and then, a couple other options here, whatever you want to do. Now, one interesting thing here is this smooth, which, as you can see, it makes it more of a gradual glide instead of sudden jumps. So instead of, especially at the faster rate, instead of jumping up and down through here, as we bring this up, it kind of averages out the high and low points and makes it more of a smooth kind of feel. And what I've noticed is that early on, in this knob here, you don't really hear much of a difference, but once you get to around 60, 70, 80, then it starts to get a lot more noticeable. And then up to 100, there's almost no change. It's almost a constant note depending on what you have going on. So if we bring this up here, so at 100, you can actually watch the filter. You can kind of see it wobble just a little bit. And now because it's smoothed out, it does have to gradually move from the starting point up to the average. And now you can kind of see it, almost, it looks like it's glitching a little bit. But then as we bring it down, you can hear it. It's more of almost like a sine wave at that point. So just another cool option that you don't normally see in LFOs. The next part we're going to look at is the velocity and note section over here. So first of all, velocity, how hard you hit something. In this case, it's tracking the notes that you're playing. You're pressing on your keyboard. So if you have a MIDI keyboard, how hard you push the notes will bring this stuff into effect. If you don't have a MIDI keyboard, when you click in notes down here, at least in Ableton Live, this is the velocity, and so you can manually set those. Just an interesting... normally you don't use those a whole lot, at least I don't, but you probably should start using them some more because they can do a lot of cool things. And so for this case, we'll use the filter cutoff again. And so how this works is it's going to affect the filter cutoff. In this case, down here, the filter is more or less off, or all the way down. Up here, it's wide open. And so this is for hitting the notes really softly. This is for hitting the notes really hard. So as we play a note, you can kind of see where they go. And trying to hit it really softly, put it down here. And then as we hit it harder, you can hear the filter opening up a lot more, and you can see it hitting up here. So now if we go in here, let's go ahead and close this. So now we have just a couple different notes opening, the different velocities that we've recorded in. So as we play this, you can hear the filter opening and closing and stuff depending on our drawn in velocity. So this section down here is now emulating you playing the notes hard or soft, which is really helpful, especially if you're not that good at playing piano like me. You can click in the notes and give it more automation this way, more movement that way. So that's the velocity, and again, just really useful for giving motion to your sounds. You give it something different happening. And yet again, you can draw in cool stuff over here if you want. And this is really can get complex, so you have to be careful with this. But depending on how hard you hit it, maybe you want it to open up. For a small section here and then there. I don't know. You get creative with it. Do whatever you want. And then to reset that, you right-click and then init graph. Now, the note has the same kind of thing. So again, starting over here is the bottom end of the keyboard. Going over here is the top end of the keyboard. Down here is, in this case, a low filter cutoff. Up here is opening up the filter cutoff. So if you we put that on here and get rid of this. If we press a low note right now, you'll see the filter cutoff is down fairly low, and if we press a high note, the filter is opening up a bit more. Now, personally, I don't like that as much. The higher notes don't have as much harmonic content as the lower notes, and the lower notes need that higher buzzy kind of sound to help them stand out. So at least for the sake of this demonstration, we'll swap it. So now the higher note it can tend to get lost a little bit, so you kind of have to mess with it a bit. But the higher notes are more of a sine kind of wave, and the lower notes are more buzzy now. So it can be really cool, and then you can actually, bring this down and, do something like that, let's say. So the whole bottom half of your keyboard will now have the filter wide open. But then as you cross a certain threshold, the cutoff goes all the way down, or, if you wanted to not quite have it. Actually, we can just bring this down. Something like that. Whatever you can do whatever you want. So you can break the keyboard up into separate sections where this section has this effect and then this section has the opposite or only halfway. Whatever you want to do with it. And then so especially if you're playing live, this can be really cool. But if you're just clicking in notes like I just showed before, it can be the same thing. If you want to have certain notes have that effect and others not, or at least not as much, then you want to use this section here. So really cool stuff that I feel like isn't used as much as maybe it could be. All right, now the last section we're going to talk about in Serum for automating your sounds is this little macro section here. Now we have 4 knobs, and again, they can control any number of things. I have to grab over here. Let's just grab and put it on, let's see, like the pan. We'll put it on wavetable position, but let's grab a different one. Let's add some sub. So now we have this sound. Oh, turn on the filter. So we got oscillator A, we have the sub, we have wavetable position, pan, cutoff, and resonance, all being affected by macro 1. So as we play a note, you can see everything is changing at once. Now, this isn't that impressive because everything is going from min to max, that's great. But where this gets really interesting is, let's go ahead and reverse this resonance. So now it'll start at the high resonance and then go down. And then I don't want the pan to go all the way, so we'll only go a little bit. We'll move wavetable position. So we can have multiple things going at different ranges, going reverse from where they started. And now we have this sound. So as I go slow, you can see there's like a little blue dot around there that kind of shows you where the actual knob is at that current time. So you can see they're all moving at different rates and in different directions sometimes, in different amounts. And that's where these macros get really cool, because it just gives you so much more control over every aspect of your synth. Again, another cool way you can use these macros is if you're playing a show live or just trying to record in things live. You can map all 4 of these to different knobs on a MIDI controller and then have them all control different things. Now you can't have them control the same knob. It just, it can only have one setting at the same time. So if you're turning one's going to get overridden, or it won't, just, so you want to try and keep them separate. And, but you can control pretty much everything on your screen at once with multiple macros and have them doing different things to just give you all kinds of motion and movement in your sound. So definitely something to play around with if you haven't already. And, just see what you can come up with this stuff. It's really, the sky is the limit with all these different options you have. Now, before we end this this video, I wanted to go over a little bit of automation options that you have in your DAW outside of Serum. So if we come over here to the arrangement view, when you click on a knob, you can see the thing change up here. So here is where you're selecting your tool. So in this case, it's Serum. We don't have anything else. If we had other plugins in a chain down here, then you can pick other plugins here. And then this is the option that you're going to, like the parameter that you're going to change. So as we click on other ones, you'll see them change here. Now, if an option or a parameter is already being controlled by some other automation device, an LFO envelope macro, you can't automate it here in Ableton Live. So if we try and click on these, you'll see that nothing happens here. And again, that's because it's already being automated. So if we try to automate it again, you'd be sending 2 different signals to one parameter, and the computer doesn't know which one you want. It can only have one choice at the same time. So it's not going to let you automate a second time. So if you're wondering why, that's why. You can't automate something in Serum and then automate the same parameter in a different space. But if we were going to do something like the level here, the volume, we can, do that here and whatever you want to do. And then as we go through here, this would send a signal to the level to automate. And lower the volume, bring the volume back up, anything you want to do with any parameter that's not already being modulated. So this is a nice way. So in Serum, you can modulate things, within that clip or whatever, within that note, however long the key is pressed for. Very useful. But if you wanted to have more longer automation, things that would change more gradually or for different sections of your song, you want to do that outside of Serum. I guess you could use the macros and do it on a MIDI controller. But drawing it in here is one way to do that. The other way that you can actually manipulate sounds and automate things within your DAW is by having macros, at least in Ableton Live, in the instrument rack. So let's say you have the analog synth here. If you hit Control G or Command G, you'll put it in an instrument rack that groups it into a rack. Or you can alternatively just come in here, get an instrument rack or an audio effect rack, whatever, and then put your synth inside that. So now if we click this top button below the off-on button, you'll see we have 8 macros. And what we can do is, let's use the filter again, right-click, map to macro 1. Now when you have one thing mapped to it, it will change the name to that parameter. If we also map the resonance to it, it goes back to macro 1 because it controls multiple options here. So let's do this one. So now we have 3 different things that are being controlled by this one macro, and you can watch them change. But let's say you don't want to, you don't want to have the resonance go from 0 to 100, just like the frequency does. Maybe you want to swap the resonance so it's all the way on at the beginning, but then as you bring the knob up, the resonance goes down. And let's say you also want to have the semitone over here, the tuning, only adjust it by 2 semitones. You don't want it to have it, the whole range. Well, in Serum, you could just click and drag that little knob next to it. Here, you can't do that. So how you would make that change is click on Map. And you got to have this open up here. And then you have the macro mappings section. So this tells you which macro number you're on, which knob, which synth or effect or plugin or whatever is affecting that, and then which parameter inside that. Then you have the minimum and maximum values of what that macro is going to control. So for the resonance, when it is all the way off, the resonance is at 0%. When the macro goes all the way up, the resonance goes to 100. So if we wanted to swap those, we would just bring this up to 100 and then this down to 0. And you can do any number in between if you want. So with the tuning here, the semitone here, the minimum is going to be, well, let's say -2. And the maximum will say +2. So now when we move this, let's get out of here now. You'll see the semitone goes from -2 to +2. And the resonance and the frequency are kind of going opposite of each other. So that's how you get different variations of that, or swap, the polarity of things, reverse things. And again, just gives you a lot of control. And you can, let's see if we go back over here, we have macro 1 selected, so we can actually, come on. We can adjust how this macro goes by automating and drawing in automation for our entire arrangement if we wanted. So a whole bunch of options here. If we open up Serum again, all of this whole section here is just full of options for automating your sounds. If you wanted to automate things over the length of your song, your arrangement, in Ableton Live, you would go into the arrangement view, click on the parameter you want to change, and then it'll be highlighted here, and you can draw in whatever you want for it. And then just go from there. And just, automation is really the best way to make your sound and your song more alive and give it interest. If you have the same sound playing through your whole song, even if it's a great sound, it's going to get boring just because it's the same thing over and over and over and nothing changes. But if you start off with a filter, cutting out some of the frequencies at the beginning, and then the next time that sound comes in, it's opened up a bit more, and then the third time it's all the way open, then there's progression to your sound and throughout your whole song. If you have an LFO controlling something, who cares what it is? Maybe the pan, it's going left and right. Maybe slowly, so it's not as crazy going. That can give a lot of interest to your sound as well and to your song. So automating things and using these effects, these modulators on your sounds and throughout your song is just a huge, huge thing that you need to get started with. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit more about how to automate your sounds within Serum and within Ableton Live. If you have any questions, just let me know. Leave a comment below. Be sure to like and subscribe to my channel on this video, and leave a comment below with any other questions that you have about sound design, synthesis, music production. Let me know what you want to see next, and I'll see you next time.